Nobody in the kingdom of Valdenmoor went near the lower stairs. Not the soldiers, not the servants, not even the senior advisors who had walked every corridor of the royal palace for decades. The stairs led down into a part of the palace that no one officially talked about. There were no lanterns on those walls. There was no guard posted at the entrance, because no guard was willing to stand there. Whatever was kept at the bottom of those stairs, people agreed, was better left alone. Seraphine Calloway had been at the palace for 3 days when she smelled the infection. She was not supposed to be there at all. She was a healer from a small town called Mirith, 3 days east of the capital, and she had only come because a message had arrived at her mentor's clinic asking for a replacement while the royal physician recovered from a fever. Her mentor was too old to travel. Seraphine was 23 and had no good reason to refuse. So she packed her satchel, said goodbye to the only life she had known, and came to the grandest palace she had ever seen. She had expected the work to be straightforward. Palace nobles caught the same colds and fevers and muscle pains as anyone else. She had expected to be busy, a little intimidated, and home within a few weeks. She had not expected to smell rot coming from below the kitchen corridor on her 3rd night. She had been returning from treating a young kitchen worker who had burned her hand on a cooking pot. The corridor was empty and dim, and she was about to turn left toward the healer's quarters when something stopped her. It was not a sound, it was a smell, faint but unmistakable to anyone who had spent years working with wounds. Infected flesh, untreated and worsening. Seraphine stood very still for a moment. Then she turned toward the smell instead of away from it. The stairs were narrow and unwelcoming. The stone walls were damp. Her lantern pushed back just enough of the dark to see where she was stepping. She went down slowly, telling herself she would turn back the moment anything felt wrong. What she found at the bottom was a single iron door, slightly ajar. She pushed it open. The room beyond was large and cold and almost completely dark. Chains ran from the far wall and ended at a figure sitting on the floor with his back against the stone. He was enormous, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that fell across his face. His shirt was torn and his wrists, where the iron cuffs had worn through the skin, were raw and badly infected. His eyes, when they opened and found her standing in the doorway, were the color of burnished gold. He was not fully himself. That was the only way Seraphine could later describe what she saw. He was between 2 states, like a man caught halfway through a transformation that had been interrupted and never allowed to finish. His hands were wrong at the joints. The bones of his face held a tension that should not have been there. He looked like something that had been in pain for so long it had forgotten what the absence of pain felt like. He made a sound low in his chest, a warning. Seraphine did not run. She had been cornered by frightened animals before, and she knew that running was the worst thing she could do. She kept her voice very calm and very quiet. She said that she was not there to hurt him. She said she was a healer, and that she had followed the smell of his wounds. She said she would not come any closer if he did not want her to. She said she just needed to know he was alive. He stared at her. The warning sound faded. He did not speak. She sat down just inside the doorway, cross-legged on the cold floor, and opened her satchel. She took out her supplies one by one and named them aloud so he could see she had no weapons. She talked as she worked, just softly, the way she had learned to talk to animals in pain when she was young. When enough time had passed and he had not moved or threatened her, she stood slowly and walked toward him. She cleaned the wounds on his wrists as well as she could. He held absolutely still the entire time. When she was finished, she left clean bandaging, a container of salve, some bread, and a small flask of water. Then she walked back to the doorway and said she would come back tomorrow night. She kept that promise. The 2nd night, he was still wary, but he did not growl. The 3rd night he let her change the bandaging without making any sound at all. By the end of the 1st week, the infection was receding. By the end of the 2nd week, he had begun to watch her arrive with something in his expression that was not quite trust but was close to it. On the 14th night, he pressed his forehead to the cold iron bars between them for just a moment, and she understood that in whatever way he could still manage, he was telling her something. On the 15th night he spoke. His voice was rough from what sounded like very long disuse. He said his name was Rowan. He said he used to be called the King's Beta, which in Valdenmoor meant the 2nd highest authority in the kingdom, the Alpha King's most trusted official. He said he had been sent to the dungeon not for any act of violence or treachery, but for disagreeing. He had stood in open court and told Alpha King Calum Voss that a decision the king had made was unjust. He had done it plainly and without apology. The woman the king had chosen to bind into royal service against her will had been Rowan's own cousin, and he had not been willing to stay silent. The king had not had him killed. Death would have been too simple. Instead, he had been stripped of his rank, his name, his place within the kingdom's social bonds, and chained in a room that no one visited. He had been told he would remain there until he was willing to publicly take back every word he had said. He had not taken any of it back. Rowan said he was telling her this, not because he wanted her sympathy. He was telling her because she deserved to know what she was sitting beside. He said that when she knew the full truth of it, she should not feel any obligation to come back. Seraphine listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she told him what she had spent 2 weeks quietly observing. She told him the guard rotation. She told him the location of the key she had noticed, hanging in an unlocked cabinet 3 corridors up. She told him the hour each night, when the lower passage was entirely empty. She told him she had been watching the lock on his door, and she believed she could open it. She said she could get him out. She said the decision was entirely his. She said she would not ask twice. Rowan was silent for a long time after that. He looked at her with those gold eyes, and she could see him weighing something very heavy. He said that if she did this, the king would not forgive her. She was a replacement healer from a small town. She had no title and no protection. What she was describing would be considered a direct act against the crown. She said she had not come to Valdenmoor looking for anyone's forgiveness. She had come because there was work to be done, and she had the skills to do it. She looked at his wrists, which were finally beginning to heal, and she said she was going to be practical about this. Rowan looked at her for another long moment. Then he nodded. On the night of the new moon, when the corridor above was at its emptiest, and the palace was as quiet as it ever got, Seraphine came down with her lantern and her satchel and a small set of metal picks she had made herself over the previous 3 days from materials in the healer's supply room. She knelt in front of the lock and worked by feel and by the faint sound of the mechanism responding to pressure. It took 12 minutes. When the last pin gave way and the door swung open, the sound of it felt very loud in the silence. Rowan stood. He was taller than she had realized. The chains had kept him hunched. Standing at his full height, he seemed to fill the room, and for one very brief moment, standing there in the dark with him free of every constraint, she had found herself wondering, in some small and very honest part of her mind, if she had thought this through. He looked down at her. He said nothing. Then he walked through the door and stood beside her. Not in front of her, not behind her, but beside her. Together they moved toward the stairs. They did not reach the upper corridor. A young guard coming back from the kitchen with his own late supper saw the light and the shadow at the top of the stairs and did exactly what he was trained to do. Within minutes, the alarm had moved through the palace, and before Seraphine and Rowan had crossed half the length of the corridor, the lights were coming on and the doors were opening. They were brought to the Great Hall. Seraphine had seen the Great Hall briefly during her first day at the palace. During a general introduction tour, she had thought it impressive then. It was something else entirely at this hour, with torches lit and the court assembling in various states of waking, lords pulling robes over their nightclothes, and soldiers taking positions along the walls. At the head of it all stood Alpha King Calum Voss. He was not a man who looked diminished by being woken in the middle of the night. He stood at the raised end of the hall in plain dark clothing, his expression controlled and still. He was perhaps 40, with the kind of face that had once been open and had learned, over years, to give very little away. He looked at Seraphine and said her name, just her name, like a question. She answered him without waiting to be prompted. She said she had found a man being destroyed by infected wounds and isolation in his own palace, and she had treated him, and she had freed him, because those were the things she was capable of doing, and she had believed they needed to be done. She said she would answer for it however he required. She said she would not apologize for it. The room was absolutely still. No one spoke to Calum Voss like that. Not lords with long family histories, not generals with battle records, not foreign ambassadors who outranked every person in the room. A 23-year-old healer from a town no one had heard of stood in his great hall at the wrong end of midnight and said those words directly to his face and did not look away. He said nothing for a moment. His expression remained unreadable. The court did not breathe. Then Rowan moved. He stepped forward, which drew every eye in the room. Hands went to weapons, shoulders pulled back. The soldiers along the walls moved a fraction closer. Everyone in that hall had heard of the king's captive, had built some version of the story in their minds, and whatever they had imagined, it was large and dangerous, and not something they wanted taking a step in a direction no one had anticipated. But Rowan did not move toward the king. He turned. He turned to Seraphine, who was standing just behind his left shoulder, and he bowed. Not a small or uncertain bow, a full and deliberate bow, slow enough that every person in that hall had time to understand exactly what they were seeing. It was the bow of a second to the one who held his loyalty. It was a public and formal declaration, the kind that carried weight in Valdenmoor whether the person receiving it held a title or not. He held it for 3 full seconds. Then he straightened and remained where he was, beside her. The great hall was silent in a way that had texture to it. Calum Voss looked at the two of them for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, though his face still gave very little away. Then he asked Seraphine, quietly, why she had not come to him first. She said, because she had not believed he would say yes. She held his gaze, and added that she hoped she had been wrong about that. The silence stretched. The torches moved. Somewhere near the back of the hall, a log shifted in a brazier. Then the king spoke. He spoke not in anger, but in the measured tone of a man making a decision he would have to stand behind for the rest of his reign. He said that the conditions in the lower room had been an error in judgment, that he took responsibility for. He commuted Rowan's sentence. He acknowledged the challenge Rowan had raised, years before, as one made in good faith even if the manner had been unwelcome. He then turned to Seraphine and told her that the position of head palace healer was hers if she wanted it, noting that no one in that position had ever been human, and that he expected the adjustment would be interesting for everyone involved. He said it in a way that might have contained something very close to dry humor, if a person was listening for it. Seraphine said she would take it. Rowan was told he was free to leave Valdenmoor entirely, or to stay and rebuild his standing, in whatever way he chose. It was, the king noted, the first choice he had been given in years. Calum said it without elaboration, but the acknowledgement was there. Rowan said he would stay. He said it without ceremony. He said there were people in this kingdom he had once served, and he would like to serve them again. He did not say anything else, but when the formalities were done, and the court began to disperse, he walked out of the great hall, alongside Seraphine, and that said enough. The story spread through Valdenmoor, the way true things always do, not through any announcement, but through the telling and retelling of people who had been in that hall, or who knew someone who had been. It changed slightly with each telling, the way stories do. Some versions made Seraphine braver than she had been. Some made Rowan more broken than he actually was. Some versions said the king had wept, which was certainly not true, but perhaps said something about what people wished had happened. What everyone who had been there agreed on was the bow. That part never changed in any telling, because it had been so clear and so deliberate that there was no way to misremember it. A man who had survived years in chains because he had refused to take back what he believed to be true had walked into the grandest hall in the kingdom and given his loyalty freely, openly, in front of everyone, to the only person who had walked down those stairs and treated him like he was still worth saving. He had not given it to the crown. He had not given it to power or to survival, or to any of the things people give themselves to when they have been broken long enough. He had given it to a woman with a healer's satchel and an inconvenient conscience who had told him plainly that she had not come to Valdenmoor to be forgiven. She had come to be useful, and she had been.